Hello, today I am talking about the book Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. I know that this is a very popular poetry book. I had heard of it and seen it before and recently decided to read it because I have been reading some novels in verse, which this isn't exactly like that, but I will describe it later. But I saw some YouTube videos about this kind of poetry and the controversies around it and just people's thoughts on it, and I thought it would be interesting to try it out for myself. I figured my library would have a copy of this, and they did have an ebook copy on Libby already available to be checked out, so I decided to try it out, knowing that because it's poetry it would probably be pretty quick to read, so it's the kind of thing I don't mind checking out. Right now my experience with poetry is I have not read a lot of it. If you were to ask me how I feel about it, I would say I don't really love it. Not that I dislike it, but maybe it's just not for me. And I know that there are all kinds of poetry, and I know that this book does not define what poetry is. In fact, there's even debate about whether or not what's in this book can even be considered that. So part of this video is to have a discussion and hear other people's thoughts if they've read this. But yeah, I don't read a lot of poetry. Like I said, I've been reading novels in verse. That's a little different because that's a story rather than a collection of things that aren't really related. Although for this book, the poems are kind of related and it's kind of like a story, but I wouldn't call it a novel. That's not how it is marketed. So I'll describe the formatting of this book. This book is split into 4 parts: the hurting, the loving, the breaking, and the healing. Like I said, I would say the poems are related because it is kind of like a story just told in poems, but it's not exactly a narrative. They're kind of all poems that go together in a certain order that seem to be based on the author's experiences. I really just have not read much poetry, and it's possible that if I read more of it, I will find some that I like. I don't want to write it all off entirely, but so far I feel, and not because of this book, but just from what I knew of poetry in general, I feel like I prefer novels. Throughout this book, there are multiple poems in each section, and the poems have little illustrations to go along with them. They're nothing too crazy, they're just kind of like black doodles. I mean, sometimes they're detailed, but I would say they're pretty simple, but I thought that they were a nice addition to this. I thought that they went well with the poems. This book definitely goes over a lot of deep, serious topics, and it is definitely very adult. Some of the topics it goes over are love and relationships, consent, assault, father-daughter relationships, trauma, generational and otherwise, the idea of fate, selfish people, healing from a breakup, beauty, particularly from the perspective of a woman of color. The author is Indian Canadian. Femininity. So those are some of the things that the book goes over. Like I said, it does kind of have a story. It seems to involve a little bit about the author's childhood and then a relationship she got into, or maybe I should say the narrator. I assume it's rather autobiographical, but we'll say the narrator, and then the relationship ending, and then the author healing from that and learning to be more confident in herself and having a better idea of who she is and giving advice to the reader as well. I thought that this book did have some good advice. I'm not sure if I agreed with all of it, but I think that some of it was actually good. So this book definitely has, I would say, some substance to it. I couldn't relate to some of the things in this book, but some of the ideas and feelings I could relate to. But whether I can relate or not, it gives me a perspective which is good for me to hear. It can help you understand other people more. This book did make me feel and think, kind of challenge some of my ideas. So I wouldn't say that it's a bunch of shallow nothingness, and I can definitely understand the book's appeal and why so many people have read it and perhaps resonated with it. I think that a lot of things in this book will be relatable for a lot of people because it goes over topics that a lot of people have experience with, like relationships. So it's not very specific situations, really. I think the author made this very honest, very raw and straightforward. I would say she doesn't really sugarcoat certain things. I think that a lot of the poetry in this was pretty literal and, like I said, straightforward, whereas some people might not consider it poetry because it doesn't rhyme or isn't speaking in metaphors. I would say there were some metaphors in the book, some figurative language, so it wasn't all completely literal, but I think that the metaphors were easy to understand. But I've heard some people say they don't want to read poetry like that. They want it to be complicated because they like trying to figure it out, and I can understand that. But I think the accessibility of this book is what makes it so popular. You don't really have to sit and think about what certain things mean. It's pretty easy to understand. Personally, I think that from reading this, I would say I enjoy the more literal kind of poetry. Not that I can't enjoy other kinds, but I did like that this was easy to understand, and that doesn't make it bad. Now, whether or not it can be considered poetry, I mean, the way it's written, I think would be considered that. I guess it does read kind of similarly to novels in verse I have read. I would say one of the differences is that it, like I said, feels less like a narrative. It's less of like this happened or I did this, and more of the author talking about her feelings, and she may bring up certain instances that happened, but it's kind of when she's already talking about a certain topic. Online, such as in the YouTube videos I've seen about this author and similar works, I have seen it be called things like insta poetry, which is, I think, partially because it's instant in that people feel that it is easy to write, although just because something is short does not mean it was easy to write or that it took no effort. You can still have trouble finding the right words, for example. But I think it's also called insta poetry because it's like popular on Instagram. It's very shareable because it's just black text on a white background with some simple doodles, and so that's very easy for other people to create and consume. I've also heard this be called notes app poetry and free verse. Personally, I could find this style of poetry inspiring to other people, showing them that they can easily write that kind as well. Not that there was no effort or struggle put into this. Like I said, I think that it's not necessarily easy to write just because it's short, especially because the topics were very big and serious. And I imagine that writing this was probably therapeutic for the author, and I know she's had a lot of success with it, so I'm happy for her in that. Hopefully writing this helped her. I know that writing about your experiences can help you process them better and heal from them, which, like I said, the healing is one of the sections in this book. I don't mind the literal language or the fact that this doesn't rhyme. My biggest issue with this is the writing style when it came to the grammar and the punctuation. Like, there was some punctuation, but for example, it's written in all lowercase. I personally am not a fan of that style, and I felt like with the way this was written, sometimes it was really confusing and I had to read things multiple times to understand, not to know what the author meant, but because there were periods, but not always, and there would be a few lines of words, and the way it was written that was the author's choice to write it that way, but it was kind of confusing because it was like normally that's where a sentence would end, but it was on the same line with nothing separating it from the other words, and so that was a little confusing and I didn't quite like that. I understand that that's just the writing style. I personally prefer to use proper grammar even if it were poetry. I know that writing style is pretty popular though, and I think that's part of why people like it so much. Maybe it makes it feel more casual or does something with the mood. I'm sure every decision you make with it plays a part in how it feels to the reader, but yeah, I personally didn't like that. If it were just all lowercase but had proper punctuation and grammar everywhere, it wouldn't be too bad, but it was a little confusing, not just with the lowercase letters, but with how things were written. And there were other aspects of some of these poems that I found kind of confusing, because sometimes it would seem that she was talking to the reader. She would say you, but I wasn't always sure who she was talking to, because sometimes it seemed like she was talking about herself, and other times it would seem she was talking about the person she was in a relationship with. So sometimes I kind of understood, and sometimes I was like, who exactly are you talking to? So that was a little confusing. Like I said, I know that this doesn't represent all poetry, so I know that if I say I don't love this, people wouldn't want me to think that this is what all poetry is like. I'm very aware of that. But right now, I just don't feel a desire to read much more poetry. I may in the future. I just don't really have it in my plans, and I just wanted to read this because I'd heard about it and it was easily accessible. If you haven't read this and maybe are interested in reading it, I hope I have given you a better idea of what it's like. Personally, I would give this 3 stars. I had some issues with it and did not absolutely love it, but I did actually really like some of the messages and ideas in this book, and I do think that it went over important, serious topics, and I could definitely see it being relatable and profound for a lot of people, especially young women. I believe I heard the author was 22 when she first published this. Right now, I don't have any desire to read anything more by this author. I know she's published some other works, and while this was okay, I just wanted to check this out because this is like her big one. However, I'm glad I gave it a try. If you've read this book or anything else by this author, or maybe anything similar like this kind of poetry, I would love to hear your thoughts, and thank you for watching.